I've been doing this since 1990, and I've talked to a lot of authors, and a lot of books have seemed very timely to me, but none, and I mean none, and that's 34 years of talk radio and television, has ever been as timely as this book, Targeted Beirut, by our friend Jack Carr and James Scott. Jack was last on when his most recent Terminal List thriller, Red Sky Morning, came out, but both of them join me now because, wow, talk about amazing timing. Good to see you again, both of you. I haven't met you before, James. I haven't read your work either, but it's good to see you both. Jack, let me start. When you planned Targeted Beirut, did you have any idea that payback would be this weekend?
3 years ago, I knew exactly to the week what would be happening in the Middle East. So I made sure that we were done in time to get it published. It is uncanny. It was about 2.5 to 3 years ago when I first broached the subject with Simon and Schuster, when I thought I'd built up enough political capital to with the thrillers to be able to pitch a nonfiction series. But it ended up becoming a lot more timely than I could have ever possibly imagined.
Now, James Scott, these
Yeah,
are not good memories for me because I was at home in Ohio with my wife and family when the Marine Barracks blew up. Her father, Marine Corps Colonel, her brother, Lieutenant Colonel in the Marines, and her sister was with us, and we just stared at the screen all day long. And then I went into the Reagan administration. Did you want to do this? Because this is a very unpleasant year in the life of Americans.
Yeah, no. When Jack first reached out to me, I remember this very vividly. From I was young at the time. I was in elementary school, and I think it had such a big impact on America that it even trickled down to those of us like Jack and I who were grade school at that time. And so when he reached out to me about this, I very much wanted to jump in on it. And of course, as we're seeing this week, as Jack noted, I mean, it's just so topical that these issues, and this was an opportunity for us really to explore the seeds of this conflict in many ways. And Jack's being too modest. He has friends in the IDF. He said, "Guys, we need a little help with publicity this week. What can you guys drum up for us?" So, you know,
Well, everybody who, I don't know if everybody who was involved in the two bombings, and there were two in 1983, the April bombing of our embassy and the October bombing of the Marine Corps barracks. We mostly remember the October 1983 bombing, Jack Carr. But there were a lot of people involved in both of those massive killings of Americans who are dead this weekend as a result of the IDF. Do you have any idea the overlap, the Venn diagram?
well, I'm going to stay away from Venn diagrams. Of course, it's been in the news quite a lot lately, connected to our election. But what also people forget about is what happens between April and October. And even someone who is familiar with both of these events and where they fit in as far as our relationship with the Middle East, most people forget that we did lose people between April and October that kind of get lost in those two larger events, the embassy bombing in April and the barracks and headquarters bombing in October. But what's really relevant about this today is that October 1983 set the rules for what would come afterward, meaning Iran set the rules using proxy forces. And it showed them that terrorism works. They got the end result that they wanted using these proxy forces. And really, it's the model that the United States and to a lesser extent Israel has been working off of ever since, though that has started to shift here over the last couple weeks. October 7th was obviously a tipping point in the relationship between Israel and other forces in the region. And over the last couple weeks, through their intelligence services and their military, they have started to shift out of that paradigm that was really set back in October of 1983.
I'm taking a copy of this down too, because I got two. I got that very deluxe box that you sent out, Jack, and then I got the real one that I marked up for myself. But James, I'm taking the deluxe box down to the deputy counsel in the Reagan White House with whom I worked in the second term, because he was there in the first term, along with Judge Clark, along with George Shultz, along with all the Cap Weinberger. These were not silly people. They were not rookies. And George Shultz, as you recount in Targeted Beirut, stuck with the good of the mission all the way through the end of his life. Were you surprised that there was that little, not regret, but that little second guessing of themselves?
Yeah, to some extent, I was. I mean, I think what you saw in the Reagan administration at that time was sort of a philosophical difference between Caspar Weinberger and the Joint Chiefs and George Shultz and the National Security Council over what role the Marines could play to sort of bolster their diplomatic efforts. And, they were very like right out of Clausewitz, that war is politics by another means. And they were really trying to use the Marines as that tool to kind of help make up for the gaps that they were having at the negotiating table. And of course, the more the Marines got involved, the larger the bullseye that landed on their back became. And so, of course, we can look back now 40 years later and we can see the catastrophic results of all that, and how basically at that time, Lebanon was it was in the middle of a civil war. It was a lot of sectarian violence. A lot of outside players were coming in, Syria, Iran, of course, the Israelis. And then, here we were sending in about 1,800 Marines, incredibly small force, into the middle of this mess and trying to sort of provide some sort of stabilization. So
please stand by, gentlemen. I'm going to talk to you after the close of today's program. We'll play it, and tomorrow morning we'll put it on the podcast today. Jack Carr and James Scott are going nowhere. Go get targeted Beirut, because the war with Hezbollah and America, and really with Iran, begins not with 9/11, but with October of 1983, even arguably April of 1983. It's all in targeted Beirut. It's very eerie that the book dropped today, but it did, and they're here, and I'm going to talk to them about it. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned if you're listening online, and it'll be on the podcast and tomorrow morning as well. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Harley. Thank you, Dwayne. I am back now with Jack Carr and James Scott. They have authored the brand new book, Targeted Beirut. It is planned as the first in a series, I believe. Am I right about that, Jack? That Targeted Beirut
Correct.
is part one of the Targeted series?
It is, and it's one for a reason, and that's because it was such a pivotal moment in our relationship with the Middle East. When I pitched Simon & Schuster on it, I wrote down about 3 pages of different terrorist events from the end of World War II up to about 3 years ago when I talked to Simon & Schuster, and I kept coming back to October of 1983, to the full year of 1983, actually, as that time that was so pivotal, because those rules would be set during that time frame and would be the ones that we continue to play by today.
I'm going to go back to the specifics, but I want to do a little inside baseball, Jack. You go find James Scott. Now, I have not read Target Tokyo, Black Snow, many of his books, often Pulitzer nominated. How did you two connect? I'm always curious when collaborators, sometimes they don't end up being friends when they collaborate. Jack, tell me how you found him, and James, tell me what it's like dealing with a thriller writer and a SEAL.
Yeah. So it sounds strange now because there's so much out there where you can do research on people, but I just loved his work. He has 5 books out. That's 4 on World War II, 1 on the USS Liberty, and I loved the work. And I was so busy working on the thrillers and the scripts for the TV show and all those things that I didn't even go to YouTube to try to look up an interview with someone talking to James to see if he was a crazy person or nice or mean or what kind of a feeling I got. I just loved the work. And when I was talking to my agent and my editor and publisher, Emily Bessler at Simon & Schuster, I said, I only want to work with James Scott on this because I don't want this to be a work of pop history where I just read a bunch of books on terrorism and the Middle East and regurgitate those, maybe give a little bit of my own analysis and put it out there. I want this to be a serious work of history. With
I got to tell you, James, the first one of your books I'm going to read is on the Liberty, because in the world of talk radio, it's a signal to get the caller off the line if anyone brings up the Liberty. And you probably understand why. They think it was a plot. You know, Jay, explain why I would not want anyone who wants to start the conversation off on, they sank the Liberty.
Yeah. So, and Hugh, I have a personal connection to Liberty in that my father was the damage control officer on board. And so,
oh my goodness.
So I grew up having a personal connection to that story. And I didn't realize just what you mentioned, sort of the aura surrounding the Liberty until I had already sold the book and was neck deep into writing it. And of course, this was almost 20 years ago. And so it does, because, the Liberty was an American spy ship sent into the Middle East that was attacked by our ally, Israel. And it has sort of spawned ever since then legions and legions of different theories and ideas about it and whatnot. And so I approached that when I wrote that book very much like we did Targeted. If it didn't come from a document from an official source, or if it didn't come from an interview from an official person, it didn't make it in the book. Because the world's full of too many different conspiracy theories and things like that.
Oh my goodness! Now I have one that I can trust. That's an offshoot. Let's get back to Targeted Beirut. I wanted a quote from the Long Report. Well, first tell people what the Long Report is, James.
Yeah, so the long report basically was the Defense Department commissioned a study of what happened in Beirut right after it all went down. And so they got Admiral Long on board with a bunch of other senior officers to really sort of do interviews with the senior leaders who were there, sort of really all the way up and down the chain of command. They did it, in Beirut. They did it in Washington, other places like that, to sort of put together an autopsy of what went down in Beirut. So the end result of that is the long report.
And the big quote on page 302: the systematic, carefully orchestrated terrorism which we see in the Middle East represents a new dimension of warfare. That's December 20th of 1983. Jack Carr, have we figured it out yet that this is not going anywhere?
We have not figured this out, and there was terrorist events, of course, before October, before April of 1983. There were terrorist events after that time frame, but they all fit this model that really came to fruition at the end of October, because the United States never responded to this attack. There was a lot of tough talk out of the administration in October, in November, and then in early 1984, we leave about as quietly as one can. So there was no retaliation. And talking to a lot of the Marines in the research for this book, they have not forgotten that. They have not forgotten that their brothers were not avenged, and they also realized that the Marine Corps moved on very quickly in the wake of this attack. This wasn't raising the flag on Iwo Jima. This was not a glorious day for the Marine Corps. It was a very dark day, and a lot of them felt like the Marine Corps moved on very quickly, which in fact it did.
James Scott, do you see a parallel as a military historian? Reagan turned the page because it was an election year in 1984. No one wanted to spend time talking about this catastrophe, the largest loss of Marine life since Iwo Jima, in a single day. No one wanted to talk about it in 1984. I didn't get to the White House until 1985, but I was at DOJ. It was not part of the campaign. Look what we did in Beirut. Do you see a parallel with Abbeygate?
Yeah, no, I think very much so. I think, any kind of these, unfortunately, politics does enter into these types of scenarios, these types of tragedies. I mean, what we say about what happened in Beirut is similar to what happened in Abbeygate. It's the intersection of combat and politics, and unfortunately, whenever those two things collide like that, a lot of times it's the troops on the ground that end up paying the biggest price on that, because there is a political dimension to this. Everything, particularly nowadays, is framed through the lens of the of elections and politics. And so, as you noted, Reagan was heading into a campaign season the next year. He ultimately crushed Mondale, but they didn't know that at the time, and they were quick, as Jack noted, to want to sort of turn the page and move on from this.
And really,
Jack,
to another parallel to Abbeygate is that those decisions up there at the White House that trickle all the way down to this tactical level, that final person who's the final decision maker in this chain of decision makers that starts with the President of the United States, is still to this day an 18, 19, 20-year-old kid standing a post somewhere around the world with a rifle, off safe, finger on a trigger, watching a vehicle approach and wondering if it's laden with explosives or if it just has bad suspension. And that person is the final decision maker.
The April bombing, which you guys cover, I just have never read anything about it. I didn't know the Beirut Marathon was the day before. You got a private standing guard outside the embassy. He's slightly hungover. No one would take his job for him. It's the kind of details that Lawrence Wright put into The Looming Tower. I hope you keep doing in the targeted series. But I want to close up this way. Colonel Garrity is quoted a lot. He's the Marine who's in charge at that time. Of course, his career was over. He went and joined the agency thereafter. The entire attack on the barracks took 10 seconds. 10 seconds. It's extraordinary. Can they actually ever be stopped? I want to ask you both that. If someone's willing to die and they've got a truck, do we have to rebuild every embassy in the world, James Scott? And I'll close with you, Jack.
We've been doing a lot of that. I mean, since then, because you have to remember, and after this, we had attacks on our embassies in Kenya and in Tanzania as well. And so more modern embassies have been built more like fortresses, and they do put dragon's teeth outside and things of that nature to try to prevent these exact type of scenarios, because unfortunately, it has become a pattern that we've seen.
And Jack, what I want to ask you specifically, the blue card that the Marines had at their barracks had the rules of engagement different from the rules of engagement on the white card at the embassy. There's a famous movie, Samuel L. Jackson, Rules of Engagement. And last night, there was a mob outside of our Baghdad embassy. Do we know what the rules of engagement ought to be now in zones where there might be suicide bombers?
Well, I think the bigger question is about putting U.S. forces on the ground and putting them in those tactically disadvantageous and untenable positions in the first place. That's the real question. There's tactical things that you can do that James mentioned outside of embassies. There's rules of engagement that can be modified, but putting Marines, in this case in particular, on the ground, Marines that are trained up to go in, crush an enemy, and come home, and put them in as peacekeepers, tying their hands essentially behind their back, dropping them into a completely untenable situation that's devolving into chaos. That is not a good place to put U.S. forces if you're hoping for a different type of an outcome. So it's really about understanding the nature of the conflict in which you're engaged or about to commit U.S. forces, and that's what the senior advisors to the president really need to focus on, because that's what they owe that person at that tactical level and that person's families.
I lied. I want to ask one more question. We have a flotilla. We have a carrier strike group in the Gulf right now. I've got family aboard, and they seem to me to be targeted every day. Do you think, and I want to ask you both, that we are doing the right thing in response to the continual assault on our ships in the Gulf? James, why don't you go first?
Yeah, it's a tricky situation. Our main goal needs to be making sure that those sailors are safe and those Marines that are aboard those ships are safe. And at the same time, the engagement runs the risk of escalation. I think that's kind of always sort of that thing that hovers over. It was the same in Beirut at that time. It's there today. I mean, because and on the one hand, if it does escalate and Iran closes the straits over there, you're going to see a spike in oil prices and things of that nature. And so I think there's always this larger global perspective that sort of is the backdrop here of, if we escalate this, are Americans going to pay a much higher price at the pump? Is it going to destabilize global markets, things of that nature? So, but key first and foremost, of course, is making sure that those sailors and Marines that are aboard those ships are safe.
Jack, what do you think about that deployment? Do you think it is an unfortunate future volume in the targeted series?
Say that one more time.
Do you think we're just sitting ducks and that you might
No.
be writing about a destroyer or one of the escort ships to the Lincoln or whatever carrier replaces the Lincoln by not having rules of engagement that are more aggressive?
Well, I certainly hope not. We were with the commanding officer of the USS Cole a couple nights ago, getting his insights into what happened in Aden, Yemen, in back in 2000. So we keep putting our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines into these situations. But what we did see from Israel over the last couple months is something a little bit different than we've seen over the past few decades, and particularly a shift since October 7th, which is putting fear into the hearts of the enemy, making them look over their shoulder, taking out their communications network in a very creative way, targeting senior level leaders, special operations missions into Syria to target precision guided missions, missile facilities in that country that are run by Iran that are then giving those missiles to Hezbollah. So the United States can take a page from Israel's more recent playbook to keep our enemy off balance so they don't have time to plan, and are worried about their own lives rather than targeting U.S. forces.
I hope we get to that point where they are off balance and worried about their own lives. Jack Carr, James Scott, congratulations on Targeted Beirut. It's doing very well in the bookstores, and I imagine people are going to want to find out the origins of the war for the West in Lebanon. There had been a civil war before that. It's covered in the book, but 1983 was a very bad year, and it's covered in detail by Jack and James in this brand new bestseller, Targeted Beirut. Thank you, gentlemen. Talk to you again soon. Good luck on your tour.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Take care.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys.